Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here at my next YouTube video. This one's just going to be me talking about the big podcast announcement that we made on the podcast last night, Avatar Online Podcast episode 100. Link to that podcast if you want to listen to it is actually in the description, but we made the big announcement towards the end of the podcast. We did some other stuff, so I just wanted to make this kind of video separately, just focusing on the actual announcement to just make it really clear to maybe those who don't want to listen to that podcast what the actual announcement is. So, as you probably can see from the episode, the title of this video, the announcement is effectively that we are starting a new podcast. But before I get into actually talking about the details of that new podcast, I want to explain what that means for the Avatar Online podcast, the podcast I already do. It's not going away, it's not going to be replaced by this new podcast. All that's happening with the Avatar Online podcast is that it's switching from being weekly to being every 2 weeks. Now, obviously, it's been weekly for nearly the whole run of it. I think over the course of the nearly 3 years, it'll be 3 years in March that we've been doing it. We've only ever missed 1 week, like that we planned to do a podcast, but we just couldn't. And then when we first started the podcast, we actually did it every 2 weeks as well for like the first 2 or 3 episodes, but then we quickly switched to weekly. So the reason we are switching it from being weekly to bi-weekly, one is to fit in, give some space for the new podcast, which is going to be every 2 weeks itself, but also because we are entering the Avatar fandom, another hiatus, a post-show hiatus where we don't know if a new show is going to be announced. We don't know, flat out if there is ever going to be another Avatar TV show, / when it will be, if there is one. But there is still stuff going on in the fandom. Like, there's, as I talked about in my last video, there's still a lot of merch coming out next year. A lot of comics and other stuff to talk about. Plus, there's still a lot of discussion topics to talk about with Korra. We may have covered all of the episodes on Korra Roundtables, but we haven't discussed the series as a whole. Like, throughout the whole run of the podcast, we've been able to go back and look at Avatar as a whole, the whole time, mention that show as a complete series. Only from the podcast from here on out are we able to do that with Korra, and then we're able to compare them. So we still have a lot of other shows that we're planning on doing. We want to, of course we're going to do stuff like Book 4 in review, Korra the series in review. We're going to do stuff like Avatar versus Korra on the podcast. Really kind of get into what's good about each series, what's bad about each series, maybe come to a conclusion on which one is better or which one we prefer ourselves. And stuff like that. Plus other topics like unresolved questions still left in from Avatar The Last Airbender, / including Korra now that it's over. And stuff like that. We have to go back and review, book 1, 2, 3, and 4 now that this series is over, just to see how meaningful the episodes are in the grand scheme of the series. A lot of stuff still to talk about, but because there is no kind of big announcement we're waiting for, we don't want to kind of burn ourselves out on Avatar by forcing ourselves to do an Avatar podcast every week. Just because I get the feeling that in a couple of months' time, we run out of the main topics we're going to do. And we're just kind of like, oh, no news this week. And the podcast just gets kind of shorter and shorter. And we kind of get less excited, and we just kind of fade away. And maybe at some point we stop doing it. But this way, every 2 weeks, we extend out the kind of important big topics that we still have. We still are enthusiastic about Avatar because there is still stuff coming out next year and stuff like that. But we also have this kind of break with the new show that we're doing, and we're not kind of just 100% focused on Avatar, but we still have it there to cover any news that does break. So that's what's happening with the Avatar Online podcast. Apart from basically, just every second week, it'll be this new podcast that we're going to do. Other than that, it's going to be the exact same, basically. It's, of course, less kind of roundtables and more just regular episodes from here on out. But, yeah, that's that. So, now, finally, what is this new podcast that we're doing? The name of this new podcast is going to be The Movers Podcast. or to give it its long name, it's going to be Avatar Online Podcast at the Movers. But we're rarely going to call it that. It's going to be the Movers Podcast first and foremost. That's what it's going to be called, unlike iTunes and stuff like that. The podcast is going to be up on the same feeds as the Avatar Online Podcast. Nothing's going to change there. It's just that instead of you have an Avatar podcast one week, the next week what's going to download on your iTunes podcast app is going to be the Movers Podcast. So nothing changes there. But what this is, it's going to be an off-topic podcast. So we're not going to be talking about Avatar here as such. We're going to be talking about other TV shows. But we're going to be kind of using the fact that we are Avatar fans on this podcast. We're going to use this show as a basically TV show recommendation podcast. The four hosts that are going to be the main hosts on this podcast are going to be myself, Troy, Greg, and Kelly. So the hosts that have been on the more regular episodes of the podcast. That's our team of four hosts that we're going to have on. And we're going to be recommending shows to each other, as well as recommending shows that we feel that our listeners, Avatar fans, would like. And that's going to be the kind of route here, in that we feel that, as Avatar fans, we basically have pretty good taste in TV shows, and that we like one of the best shows that's come out in the past couple of years, Avatar and Korra. So other shows we like must, to some extent, appeal to one portion of the Avatar fandom. And so, again, with the Avatar fandom going into a kind of hiatus where we're not going to get as much news, they're going to be missing a show that they won't have to watch. There's no Avatar show coming out. So we're going to use this show as a way to just kind of fill in that gap, inform people about shows they may not have thought of before, and discuss it from our kind of perspective as Avatar fans. So that's the main gist of what the podcast is. Now, specifically how it's going to work is that the four hosts on the podcast, we have a specific order/cycle that we go in terms of choosing shows. The order is the order in which we joined the podcast as regular members, hosts, we're on regularly. So me, having started the podcast, I'm the original host. So I'm first. Kelly joined the podcast. I think she was the third or fourth host that we got on. So she's actually second in our kind of current batch of hosts that we have. So she'll choose second. Third is Troy, and then finally Greg. So what happens basically is that because we'll be discussing my show on the first podcast, I've already chosen. I chose at the end of Avatar Online Podcast episode 100. I'll mention specifically the show in a minute, but I'm just explaining how it works. So when we go to episode 1 of the Movers Podcast, we're going to discuss that show I discussed. And at the end of that show, Kelly is then going to choose the show that we're going to talk about on the next podcast. And then at the end of that one, Troy chooses, and at the end of the next one, Greg chooses, and then it comes back around to me on the next show. And that's our kind of cycle. We just keep choosing different shows and go on. But you may be asking, what way are we going to review shows? It's very general. What we're going to do is that when you choose a show, before the next podcast, you have to, as a requirement, watch the first 2 episodes of that show. So you have to watch those 2. If you want to, you can watch more, but you have to watch the first 2 to be on the podcast. And then we'll come on for the show, and primarily the discussion on that show will be based around those 2 episodes. And it will be based around just the fact that the person who chose the show will be the kind of expert on that show, having, felt the kind of requirement to actually recommend it. That they will have seen most of that show or all of it and be the expert on the show, while the other host will be fairly new to it. Or maybe they've seen it themselves. That's going to be an interesting dynamic as the show goes on. For example, what's going to be on the first episode, I chose the TV show Lost that we're going to be reviewing. So the first podcast is going to be recorded on January 11th. So all the hosts, including myself, we all have to watch the first 2 episodes of the TV show Lost, which are Pilot Part 1 and Pilot Part 2 before that show. And on that show, we're going to review those episodes. And I already know, because we discussed it at the end of last week's podcast, and we brought it up before, that I'm the only one on the podcast who's actually seen Lost. Greg, Kelly, and Troy have all never watched an episode. They know of the show, but they've never seen an episode of it. So that's an interesting dynamic that we're going to have there. And it's kind of going to be me as the kind of Lost expert, kind of talking about the show with three people completely new to Lost. And then with other shows, maybe we've all seen certain shows. Maybe one of us will be the only new person to a show one week and stuff like that. It's going to be an interesting dynamic as we go through. But what we're also going to be doing is like that, because we're going to have effectively the person who chose the show be the expert on it. It means I'm not going to be hosting all of the podcasts. Of course I'm going to be hosting the first one because I'm the only one who's very familiar with Lost. But when it comes to other shows that maybe Kelly, Troy, or Greg recommends, I can't be the host because I don't know much about the shows that they're going to be recommending. So you're going to see different hosts on these podcasts as well. So that's going to be interesting. And it's not just going to be a review of episodes as well. Like towards the end, the kind of key thing, part of the I suppose gimmick of the podcast is that we're going to ask everyone the question at the end. You've seen the first 2 episodes, we've discussed them. Are you going to continue watching that show? And that's the kind of big thing that it comes down to, I think, that do they like the show enough after the first 2 episodes to think it's worth watching? And, the explanations there are going to be a key part of the podcast. And then we're also going to give the person who did recommend the show in the first place a chance at the end of the podcast to give a kind of final plea to the people on the podcast, as well as the listeners, for why they should watch it, and stuff like that. So I think it's a really cool idea for a podcast that, we're only ever going to be talking about these shows one time on the podcast. We're only ever going to discuss the first 2 episodes of Lost. Like, maybe a couple of episodes in, we'll have a little segment where maybe we catch up with what everyone's been watching and stuff like that. But primarily it's going to be like, Lost is only ever going to be discussed on the first episode of the podcast. So that's that. And definitely it's kind of going to be one of those things like for listeners of the podcast that we recommend you watch the 2 episodes of the show as well and give us your feedback so we can actually read it out on the podcast the following week. So it's not just us who gives our opinion on the show as people new to the podcast, it's the listeners as well. So that's basically how it works. Final thing really to mention, I suppose, is just the rules. We do have a specific set of rules in place for what shows can and can't be chosen. They're very basic. They're just mainly to fit in with the idea that we're recommending shows as Avatar fans to Avatar fans. So the first and most important rule is that it has to be a TV show. We maybe will do special episodes on movies at some point, but for the first couple of episodes we're going to focus on TV shows. The TV show has to have a plot/story to it as well as character development, because otherwise there's not a lot to discuss there. So that rules out a lot of sitcoms, it rules out stuff like SpongeBob SquarePants, The Simpsons and stuff like that. We're looking for story, character-driven shows here that we can actually like get our teeth into and actually discuss heavily. So that's the most important rule. And in terms of age rating and stuff like that, content, the highest age rating of a TV show we can choose is 16s. This is basically just so that what we're eliminating here is just we're not going to discuss the super adult orientated stuff because we are recommending this to Avatar fans. And if we should just suddenly go first episode like Game of Thrones, like sure it appeals in that like a lot of people would say like Korra is the kids version of Game of Thrones, but not all Korra fans Game of Thrones is going to be suitable for them with how violent and how much sex there is and stuff like that. So we're not going to be just reviewing stuff like that. But we want to leave it open enough so that we can include a little bit of kind of like more darker stuff, themes and stuff like that. So that's why we've chosen 16 plus, because a lot of shows that you consider fairly tame sometimes just happen to have like a 15s or 16s rating and stuff like that. So there's that. And then finally, just nothing too obscure. Like, if the show can't be found online anywhere to watch, we can't review it. So there's that. But more than that, otherwise that's the rules. Like, just we're looking for shows that Avatar fans would like. So don't just pick some random show is the idea here. And again, at some point maybe we'll do a kind of an episode where we let the listeners choose what show we're going to review and stuff like that. But for at least the first couple of episodes, we're just going to get into the groove, give us all a chance to host one of these podcasts, all a chance to choose what show we're doing, and continue like that. So yeah, last thing to say is that I will be uploading the first episode of the podcast to my YouTube channel. Maybe if it becomes pretty popular, I'll continue to upload the episodes to YouTube. But right now it's just kind of like, just to show that this is a new thing I'm doing, and you can follow it if you want. But yeah, so the plan is just the first episode on YouTube to see if there's people like it and stuff like that. So yeah, again, first episode will be recorded on January 11th. Next week's podcast is actually going to be the Book Form Balance Award show. So thanks for watching this video, and bye.